So welcome to this week's webinar. I am Rose and I'm part of the teaching quality team, and I'm joined here by Savannah, and we will be co-hosting today's webinar, which is the first webinar of our grammar series. Now, we are going to be talking about what is the passive voice and how to teach it. So the passive voice is a very tricky grammar structure, and it can be very confusing, especially when we are teaching ESL students. So we're going to take a look at exactly what the passive voice is, how do we teach it, how do we get our students to apply it in our lessons, how can we adapt our teaching styles to meet all our students' needs. And then at the end, we're going to be sharing some of our experiences, and we'd love to hear your experiences and ideas for teaching the passive voice. So firstly, let's have a look at what is the passive voice. Now, I know that it's a very tricky grammar structure to teach and to understand, but we'd love to hear from you and fill in our poll as to what you think the passive voice is. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So we have the options of the passive voice is used to talk about events that will be performed in the future. The passive voice is used to show interest in the person or object that experiences the action. And the passive voice is used to describe an action being performed by a person or thing. So for this one, there's only one correct option. So please choose the one that you feel is correct. Great. So the passive voice would be used to show interest in the person or object that is experiencing the action. Now we're going to take a look at this in more detail. So what is the passive voice in English grammar? So the passive voice is used to show interest in the person or object that experiences an action. This means that with the passive voice, the subject is acted upon by the verb. Now this may seem like a back to front sentence when you are reading it, but it's quite simple when we look at examples. So firstly, we have Anita was driven to the theater by Carla. So a easier way to understand this would be to first take a look at the active voice. Now the active voice is what we hear most often when we are talking or when we are speaking to someone else. So it would be Carla drove Anita to the theater. Now, Anita would be the object in the active voice. And with passive voice, she becomes the subject. So the subject is being acted upon by the action, which was driven. So let's take a look at some more examples. The house will be cleaned by me every Saturday. So the subject is the house, the action is cleaned, and the verb would be And then we have another example here, which is the entire house was painted by Tom. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and you've heard the passive voice being used in articles, being used in newspapers, and we use it quite often when we are speaking. We might not know what it's called, but this is the passive voice, sorry. So we have a question. So how would you go about teaching the passive voice in your lessons?
Well, me personally, I always try to give a well-modeled example sentence, or as many as I can, in the simplest form for my students. I find that even if you explain the meaning or the structure, sometimes they find it a lot easier to understand if they see modeled examples. Then I usually use an activity or a game where they get the chance to fill something in or rearrange some words to make their own sentences. And through active participation like that, they usually get enough opportunity to practice making passive voice sentences.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing technique to use, especially when we are trying to teach them the reason for using it as well.
Yeah.
And I think illustrations and, you know, different varieties of activities are so useful in terms like in situations like this, because it can be a very complex topic to understand, yes, or even to use. So those were all great points. So now we're going to look at some teaching tips.
So briefly, the teaching tips we're going to cover starts with explaining when and why we use the passive voice. This, of course, gives our students some context behind where they might see it and find it and why we do it. Then you're going to move on to teaching the grammatical structure, which is, of course, important. But as I said, you want to break it down into its core parts. Then they should really get the chance to change as many active voice sentences to the passive voice in order for them to be more confident in it. A really good activity type is a gapful activity for this specific grammar rule, because it really helps with their confidence and, again, breaking down it into the core parts. Then we ask our students to find the passive voice in texts, because then when they come across it later on in their learning, they are more likely to know what it is. Point 6, I think, applies to all of these points, that you should use it throughout, where you apply application through use. So you get your students to make their own sentences in the passive voice, and they will be more confident in doing this. And that brings us to number 7, which I also think applies to all of the points, making it fun and lively, and getting your students to engage with the passive voice in a fun way will make it more motivating for them. So our first point is, when and why do we use the passive voice? So we really use it to talk about an action that is being experienced by a person or a thing, which is being performed by another person or thing. Essentially, what this means is that we are showing interest in the person or the object that experiences the action, rather than the person or the action, the person or the object that performs the action. Basically, what this means is the most important thing in the sentence becomes the subject of that sentence. So now we'd like to pose another question to you by looking at a few examples. Feel free to answer this in the comments below. What is the action being performed in these example sentences? So our first one, Anita was driven to the theater by Carla. And number 2, the house will be cleaned by me every Saturday. So what is the action that is being performed?
So I would say the action is driven and cleaned.
So that's perfect. Those are the actions. Now, we have one more example here. The entire house was painted by Tom. So this one, again, we can see that if driven and cleaned are the actions, the next one will be painted. We can see that these, driven, cleaned, and painted, these are our past participles. So in a passive voice sentence, there will be 2 types of verbs that we need to show to our students and to help them differentiate between these 2. The action being performed is the main verb that we need to show them. But there is also one that always comes before this, and that you will go through in the grammatical structure.
So how do you go? Oh, sorry.
That's okay. How would you go about teaching the reasons why we use the passive voice? or what experiences have you had in your lessons before? And again, please feel free to comment below with any of your experiences or tell us now.
So I think it's very important to make sure that you are teaching them why we use it, obviously. So giving them examples of, situations we might use it in, and then having them, make their own sentences using those examples or those contexts that you've said for them. We could use it when we're not sure of who the agent is, and by agent I mean who is doing the action. So for example, if we had a sentence such in the active voice, such as the children ate the cake, we know who did it, the children did. But if you had a cake at home and you weren't sure who ate it, we would use the passive voice saying the cake was eaten by someone or by somebody. So I think to just make them aware of, the different ways we can use it and the different situations we can use it in is probably a really good way to go about why we use it.
Yes. I definitely agree with all of your points. I think it's also important to point out that even though we do sometimes use it in speech, the majority of the time, I think they will really come across it in literacy, in books and reading, because it is more of a literary device that is really impactful when used right.
So now we're going to look at, just going back. So now we're going to look at teach the structure and why that is important in the passive voice. So firstly, the structure of a passive voice sentence is that it contains a form of the verb to be. Now this may be was, were, depending on the tense of your sentence in the active voice. Plus the past participle of a verb. So what is the past participle? This just means that an action was started and completed in the past. So it was completed completely in the past. And this can cause some issues for students because it's quite a difficult thing to understand. Past tense, they know drive, drove. Many of our students aren't aware of the past participle. So when teaching structure, it's a good idea to kind of break it down and, go through each step and spend time, on the verbs, on the object, on the subject. That would be the best way to kind of teach the structure. The next part would be that we use by to say who or what performed the action. So now we don't always need to include this. If we don't know who did the action or who performed the action, it's not necessary. It doesn't take away from the sentence. That is extra information. So for example, we could say Anita was driven to the theater. The sentence still makes sense, but we know who drove her there. She was driven by Carla. So that is just a easier way for them to understand. And when you're teaching structure, you can teach that first part of the sentence. And, as they get better with understanding the structure and how to form these passive voice sentences, you can add in the by whoever did it. It just takes away that, long, complicated sentence when teaching structure. So now it is your turn. Can you identify the subject, verb, and action in these examples? So the house will be cleaned by me every Saturday. The entire house was painted by Tom. So let's start with the subject first. What would be the subject of these sentences?
Well, we can see actually that in both sentences, the subject is the house.
Yep, definitely. So the house is the subject of this sentence. In the active voice, the house would be the object.
Yes.
So the next thing we're going to focus on is the verb. Now, this can be tricky because, like you mentioned, Savannah, there are two verbs in the sentence.
Yes.
So what would be our verb in these two sentences?
I think it's important to remind your students and yourself that the verb of the sentence will be the first verb that you see. So in the first sentence, it will be, and in the second sentence, it will be was.
Exactly. And then our second verb, our past participle, it would be easier to just call it our action, like we mentioned above. Yes. This will avoid any confusion, you know, if you're saying, oh, there are two verbs in the sentence, you know, which is our verb we kind of looking for, this might cause so much confusion. Yes. So it would be great if when you're teaching structure to just use it as subject, verb, action. This will eliminate any sort of confusion. So obviously, like Savannah mentioned, we have house in both sentences as the subject, be and was as the verb. Now, why is this different? Because the sentences are in different tenses. So we need to change the tense of our verb so that the sentence is cohesive.
Yes.
And then our action is cleaned and painted. These are past participle verbs. So now, what do you think? What would you do to teach the structure?
So, as I've done in the past, I always give clear examples first to show the structure. So as we have just looked at, I would give them some core examples like this that are simple and easy to change into the active voice myself, and break it down into those core parts, showing my students how to identify each of them, to find the subject, the verb, and the action. I think the action, like you said, is the most difficult part because you really want to go through some examples of the past participle. Some of them, the regular verbs, will be the ED form, but a lot of them will have a completely different form that some of your students may not have seen. I think that's a really important part to drive home before you can think of them actually making those sentences.
Exactly.
And I would build on that. So as you said, the I statement at the end is not always necessary. So if they can make that first part of the sentence and then add by, that will help them to change it more easily.
Yeah. So that's great. That's definitely a good way to go about teaching the structure. So please feel free to let us know in the comment section down below if you would like to share your ways of how you would teach the structure. So the second question would be, what problems may we come across? Now, I think with all tenses, they might be the same because tenses are very difficult to grasp and to understand and to use correctly. But the main points that we would come across when teaching the passive voice is that the students might not be clear on why we use it. So it can be very tricky to use when you don't know why we use something. So that could be the first problem we come across when teaching the passive voice. Another would be that the interference of first language. If their first language is not English, it can be extremely confusing and very tricky to use the passive voice. And to change it from active to passive, it could cause so much confusion. And of course, like we said, with them having a first language that is different to English, they might say things, in a different way or in a different structure or order of words in the sentence. And the last, I think, would be just general tenses, changing that verb into the correct tense or the correct form of the verb to create that cohesion in the sentence. That can cause a lot of problems as well.
Yes. So that brings us to point 3, which is giving them the chance to change active voice sentences into the passive voice. So how do we do this? Now, the first thing that you need to remember is that giving your students very simple sentences to start with is important. You want to give them things that they might already be saying in the active voice and to change those first. So for example, I ate an apple. That would be a lot easier to identify what is the object in that initial sentence. How do I change that to become the subject? Keep it simple like that. And as I said, try to gradually build on it. Teach them how to make the sentence with the subject and verb and the past participle first, and then introduce the by statement at the end once they have that routine down. So we can look at a few examples here. So the active voice sentence here is Tom painted the entire house. Now, before we even build, I would ask my students to identify the object in the active voice sentence, in this case being the entire house, and remind them that, okay, this object will now become the subject of your passive voice sentence. This way, when you teach it like this, I think it will remind them each time they have to do it on their own. Okay, let me find the object first. I think it's a really good starting off point for them. Then you can build on it, as I said, putting the subject. What will the verb be? What tense are we talking in? Okay, we're talking in past simple. Then I must use the past simple verb was. And of course, taking the action painted and putting it on the end. Then let's say we've done 5 examples like this, then we can go back and add the by statement to the end of each of the sentences. And I will teach them to do it like this in this process.
Yeah, I definitely think that step-by-step process is the best way to go about teaching this, because everything actually does happen in a step process.
Yes.
When you're changing from active to passive. So that might just be the easiest way to do so.
So before we move on to point 4, I would just like to promote our newly launched IQTful course. This is an 120-hour course that has been accredited by Accreditat and is available on all devices. At the moment, we are having a flash sale, so you can go to IQTful.com for more information about it. I think it's really great because it's developed by teachers for teachers. And to go with that, we also have a number of CPD courses that are now available. We have both a safeguarding and a psychology for individual learners course that are both available and on sale now. And if you would like to communicate with us in any other way, or if you would like any other content like this webinar and others, as well as other blogs and videos, you can go to any of our social media platforms and subscribe.
Great. So now we will move on to the use of gapful activities when teaching passive voice. So let's just have a look at how we can do this. So the first would be to create sentences where the verb is missing completely. Now, gapful activities are really useful for teaching, I would almost like to say, the structure of a sentence, because students become aware of what's missing, you know, what tense the verb needs to be in, what is the object, what is the action. They really become so in tune with, you know, how to structure the sentence of a passive voice sentence. It creates sentences where the verb is shown, but it needs to be changed into the past participle. So this is a great gapful activity to use, especially for, like we've mentioned, that tricky past participle and the 2 verbs being in the sentence. And then lastly, create sentences with the picture cues to help students identify the action. So this is great. This is more targeted towards our, you know, visual learning learners, and it can just help with that overall understanding, because if you have that visual image right there, you know, it doesn't matter what language you speak, you will be able to understand what is being represented there. So this could just help our lower level students, you know, have a better comprehension and grasp what needs to happen in the structure and in the actual activity.
Yes.
So now the benefits or the advantages of using Gapful activities. So it's generally, it just helps them become aware of the structure and how to, change from an active to a passive. It helps them to become aware of why we use the passive voice and which situations we would use it in. It's also really great. Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say it's also really good for motivation because it's somewhat of an easier activity on the surface. So some students will be more confident going into it. And once they understand the structure from a simpler activity like this, they would be more willing to do it on their own.
Yeah. And it helps them to become aware of the tenses and what tense they need to change that verb into, as well as, it just makes it a lot more clearer to identify the subject, verb, and action in the sentence. So there's many benefits to Gapful, and they are really, really useful. And you can create your own Gapful activities. They're so easy to set up. And there's many resources, on the internet for you to use. So I would really recommend using this when teaching the passive voice and getting your students involved, trying out and seeing where their weaknesses and their strengths are as well.
So on to point 5, which is giving your students the opportunities to identify the passive voice in a piece of text. I think this is a really important step in the process because, like I said earlier, it is a literary device and they're more likely to see it in writing. So how do we do this? Now, the first thing that you need to remember is that you need to adapt your activities accordingly to students' abilities. Don't try to give lower level students a big piece of text that's going to be too overwhelming for them. They need to see something that is quite simple, where they will be able to pinpoint the passive voice sentence. Of course, if you're teaching a much higher level, you need them to have a more challenging text, maybe with a lot of different examples that are similar, but not quite passive voice. So it's up to you and your students. It's important to teach your students to skim and scan for the things they need in the passive voice sentence. So if you've taught them the structure and how to break it down, this will be a lot easier. You teach them to look for the past participle, to look for the by, and it will help them to find those things a lot easier. Of course, when you're talking about text, you want to vary the types that you use. This both means in medium and in topic. So you'd want to use newspaper articles or something from a book or maybe even a blog, and vary the topic types to keep your students interested in what they're reading, because at the end of the day, they're not going to want to read if it's not an interesting topic. And as Rose said before, picture cues are really great for lower level students or students who are struggling a bit, be able to find action that is being performed in the passive voice sentence, or to look for certain things they might need to look out for. And lastly, I think in any lesson where you're doing a text, you want to extend and do a bit of comprehension. And in this case, you could ask them what action was being performed or what the subject was in the passive voice sentence to make sure that they fully understood what they've read. So talking about adapting and making your text fun, I want to know first, how would you adapt your text according to your students' abilities and needs?
I think the first thing I would do is try and link it to some sort of interest they may have. I think if we do this in any lesson, regardless of the material, it's already going to be interesting to your student and they're going to pay attention. It's going to be motivating to them and it's encouraging. So they try and, kind of find the passive voice or whatever the activity may be. So that's probably the first thing I would do. It's trying to apply it to their life and make it relevant to them. The next thing is to use synonyms or simplify the text if we are working with, lower level students that may not be as advanced as others or don't have such a long English learning history if they are, learning English as a second language. So I think to use synonyms that they are familiar with, vocabulary they know, change out the sentence. If they've found the passive voice, but they don't understand what it's saying, change the sentence, make it so that they fully understand what the sentence is saying or what is being communicated in the sentence. And then the last thing I would say is to use visuals, use images, use, things that they can understand by just seeing. Like we said, if you, especially an ESL student, if you don't understand what you're reading, 9 times out of 10, that student will understand when you show them an image. So visuals, and of course, like Savannah said, use a variety of methods, activities, techniques, sources. If you are doing analyzing from a text, use different types of text, and also have a backup, because you might find that your student is, a lot less capable than what you thought. Have a backup, have a simple or a more simple text ready to go for the same activity.
Yes.
So how would you make this a fun and an engaging activity? Because it can be quite boring for some students.
Definitely. I think, as with any texts or reading lessons, it's always really fun to make it fun in the way of props. So I always bring out my stuffed toys or little figurines that can tell the story. So maybe, especially if you have a lower level student, you read it together where you take turns and your toy speaks and one of their toy speaks if you're an online learner, or maybe they get to speak for the toy in class if you're in a physical classroom setting. And making funny voices like that, telling the story as you go along and telling them, okay, as we read together, you do need to try and look for the passive voice and they have to try and underline it. For older students, I would usually try to extend more in terms of comprehension. So we read the texts and we talk about the topic, if they're interested in it, if they have any feelings or opinions about it, to get more from it first before we go ahead and look for the passive voice. And I often try to get my students to be honest with me. So if they really didn't like it, I want to know from you, you didn't like the text. So next time we can find something that you might like a little bit more.
Definitely. Those are all great points. And I think it's very important to know the level of your students so that you can differentiate and change it up. Like you said, for younger students, props and games and that kind of thing. For older students, they don't mind, being asked some questions about the text or something like that. So I think it's important to know the level of your student as well as maybe the age of your student.
Yes.
So next we are going to look at application. So how can we get our students practicing the passive voice in a lesson? So let's have a look at how. So firstly, ask students to make their own sentences. Now this is pretty straightforward, and I'm sure we would all do this in a lesson, but it is really useful. This helps you to kind of grasp what their level is, are they understanding what you've taught them? Do they understand the structure? This will give you a better idea of where you might need to focus more time on when teaching the passive voice, or any tense for that matter. If they're having issues with, like we said, just the basic structure, or maybe they are unsure of which tense to change it to. So this is a great kind of concept checking mechanism in your lesson. And then set homework tasks, asking students to make sentences. So this is great because this allows that learning to continue on after your lesson. And it also gives them a little bit of independence. You know, they have to go home and practice what they've learned and come and show you in your next lesson. So these are all great ways to kind of get that application going. And then, of course, set homework tasks when they need to identify the passive voice in a variety of texts. Now, this again is a great way to expose your students to different texts, for one, as well as to just become aware of, you know, in which situations passive voice is used. Because if you kind of finding it in a news article versus in a book, they would be used in completely different ways. Yeah. So just kind of setting that task that exposes them to all those different ways of using passive voice is also really great. So now let's have a look at this question. It says, can you think of any other ways to help students practice using passive voice?
So in previous lessons that I've had, I always try to use games, especially for grammar rules, because it makes it more fun and it brings a bit of a lively element into the lesson. So for passive voice, I might make a number of cards with subjects, actions, and verbs on them, and ask the students to rearrange these into sentences, into passive voice sentences, and try to make the funniest sentences that they can, either to make their classmates laugh or to make me laugh in an online setting. This is a really fun way because you can also really adapt this to your students' likes and interests or their abilities. So if they are more confident with a certain tense, you might only use tense verbs from that tense. You might only use animals if you know your student really loves animals, and try to use actions that are kind of silly, things that animals might not do necessarily. This might be something they might read in a book. I think games are a really fun way of making something challenging fun for the students, and they're more willing to actually want to do it.
So how can you differentiate for each student's needs? So this is extremely important because, like we've already mentioned, passive voice is extremely tricky, and you need to know your students' needs to be able to adapt that. So I would firstly say, get to know your students, know what they struggle with, know their strengths, know their weaknesses, so that you can adapt the material or the activity, or, you know, maybe break down the structure for them, just to be able to get them to understand what is happening. Of course, adapt activities. That is so important. There's no point in teaching an activity that is way too advanced, or asking them to complete the activity which is way too advanced. No learning is going to take place there. The same goes for if it's too simple. You know, if they can do it in a heartbeat, there's no point to it really, because they know how to do it. So you want to challenge them, but you don't want to over challenge them or under challenge them. It needs to be challenging enough where they are applying what they've learned, and at the end of it, they are able to do it. You never want to kind of break down that confidence level. The next would be knowing their learning styles. So I think each and every student is different in the way they learn. Some learn visually, some learn, you know, by just reading what's in front of them. Some like to watch videos, some like to kind of talk most of the lesson. So know what helps them learn better, and then you can go ahead and adapt those activities and adapt your lesson and kind of use different techniques to get them engaged and involved. And then, of course, again, variety of resources is really important. Games, videos, articles, books, you know, pictures, all that kind of stuff helps with differentiating to meet your students' needs. But I think the most important thing here is know what your student needs from a lesson or during the lesson.
So that brings us to our last point, point 7, making it lively. And as I said in the beginning, it's important to do this really throughout your lessons, to plan ways to bring fun into your lessons, because teaching grammar can be really boring at the end of the day. So how can we do this? Well, firstly, as Rose said, you need to include lots of different activities. Now, a Gapful activity is a really good one to include, but there are lots of different ways that you can go about teaching passive voice.
Yeah.
And I think trying to make a game of each activity, especially with younger students, is a really good approach to teaching grammar rules. Secondly, when you vary activities, you need to consider the age and the abilities of your students. Now, you don't want to have a very silly game for very high level, maybe teenage students. They're not going to respond in the same way, and they might actually find it maybe offensive. You don't know. You need to consider that. You also need to consider, can my student actually do this? The best way to go about that is to assess your student in every lesson. If it's a new student, you're unlikely to be teaching this first, but it may happen. And you need to gauge their abilities by first introducing your lesson in a way that you get them to talk to you. You see what kind of tenses they might be comfortable with by asking them about their day, about what they did for their holidays, things like that, to gauge their abilities. And you need to adapt to their interests. And this is really easy in an online setting, I would say, because you're often in a one-to-one lesson where you get to know your students a lot better. When you're in a physical classroom setting with a big group of students, it could be a little bit more difficult to do this, but you get to know your students, the friends they have, and what the friend groups might be interested in. And in this way, you could maybe take turns. So bring in something that one group of students would like, and then in the next lesson you can bring in something that the other group of students might like. And lastly, to use funny pictures and situations in your lessons for them to make their own sentences. Now, we've already kind of spoken about this, but I think even with older students, you can do this, where you show them an image of something, maybe from a comic strip or from something that they're interested in. Maybe they like Harry Potter, who knows? You could bring in a funny picture or a very interesting picture and ask them to make a sentence in the passive voice using that. And it's a really fun activity to introduce the topic again if you're doing it in a secondary lesson. So now I'd like to know from you, please feel free to add your own experiences in the comments below, what techniques you have used in any lessons you may have taught passive voice, and what you find useful when you do.
Yeah, so please let us know. We'd love to hear your answers and share your ideas, but I'd like to share mine. So for me, I've used this step-by-step process. I've kind of just taken it, one step at a time, teaching maybe starting with kind of why we use it, spending some time on that, making sure they are aware of the reason behind the passive voice. And then moving on, to the structure and basically following the steps that we've just covered in this webinar. I think that is a useful and very good way to teach the passive voice. And once you've done that, you can kind of bring in the games and, using the visuals, putting it into context for them, kind of making it about them. That is a great way to motivate your students, to get them interested in what they are learning, because nobody wants to learn grammar. It can be very boring, but it's up to us to make it interesting and make it, useful for our students, make them see the use of using passive voice. And of course, make it fun. Use a variety of resources in your lessons. Don't be monotonous with your teaching. Don't be boring. If you're having fun in the lesson, the chances are your students having fun is very good. So I would say the best technique is to, kind of break it down, do it step by step, and then make sure it is fun. Make sure it's engaging. There's a lot happening, there's constant things changing. You're getting them to apply that passive voice. I would say that's probably my technique I would use when teaching that in a lesson.
Yeah, I really agree. That's a good point.
Great. So now we have a Q&A. Please feel free to post any comments you might have or questions or ideas you want to share. We'd love to read them or kind of share them with everybody else. So you can just comment them in the comment section, and that would be great to kind of just get your opinion and your ideas on teaching the passive voice. So we're going to end off with this quote, which is strive for progress, not perfection. And this is so true, especially with, I would say, grammar, teaching grammar. It is such a difficult thing to teach, young students, actually all students, no matter their level. And we always just want to make progress. We never want to push that perfection. If they're struggling, if they aren't getting it, that's okay. Just adapt, simplify, just, encourage them to keep trying, promote that growth mindset. And that's what we want to do as teachers at the end of the day. So as always, and as Savannah mentioned in the webinar, that we have a fully accredited TEFL course, which is on flash sale. It is fully accredited by Accredited, and it's available on all devices. So if you are interested in doing a TEFL course, please head over to IQTful. It is on sale for an amazing price, so don't miss out. As well as our CPD courses, they are on pre-order now. So please head over to IQTful and sign up to choose any of our courses. There are a huge variety, and these are also on sale now. So please don't miss out on that. And then, of course, please view our weekly webinars and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This will allow you to get notified when new webinars are being scheduled and new videos are released, as well as head over to our Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. We share resources and content daily that might help you in your lessons, or if you are in your journey to becoming a teacher. So please head over to that. And of course, please remember to click subscribe. And if you want to watch any of our previous webinars, you can find them all on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for attending, and we will see you